to meet you.
Currier. It's nice to meet you.
Hello and welcome to the Global Dialogue. I'm Shereen Bhan. US conglomerate Honeywell has taken a decision to split its businesses across 3 separate listed entities, and aerospace is going to be one of them. It will be the largest publicly traded pure-play aerospace company, but that of course happens in September of 2026, or at least towards the second half of 2026. Joining us now to talk about the road ahead and the flight path is Jim Currier. Jim, many thanks for joining us here on the Global Dialogue. It's a pleasure to have you join us.
No.
Let me start by talking to you about that decision of splitting up these businesses into 3 separate listed entities.
Correct.
And I guess we've gone through that conglomerate boom of the 1960s, and now everyone's decided that perhaps moving into separate entities and individual businesses makes sense. The conglomerate discount perhaps has weighed on this decision as well.
There's a prevailing sentiment that that's the case. I will tell you, for us within Honeywell, there were some very strategic reasons why there was a decision to ultimately separate the business into 3 businesses. We announced, advanced materials in October of last year, and just recently announced the fact that we'll be spinning aerospace from Honeywell as well back in February of this year. And really what was kind of driving some of those decisions ultimately was that the strategic direction of some of the businesses were very different.
Right.
The demand drivers for the businesses were very different as well. And so it was truly looking at the business holistically in the portfolio. What is in the best interest of shareholders? What is in the best interest of our customers? And it made sense to ultimately split the business into those 3 independent publicly traded companies, which is what we'll have going forward.
Well, the work has just begun because, as you pointed out, the decision was taken in February, and eventually we will see this culminate into a listing of a separate entity in 2026. So what can we expect between now and then?
So it's definitely in the early stages of planning, without a doubt. And I think if I were to focus on, for me in aerospace, what are some of our short-term goals and what are some of our long-term goals relative to what this decision means? Short-term, it's business as usual in terms of we're still one Honeywell. We still have commitments that we need to make to the organization that we will deliver on those commitments, both financially and from a delivery standpoint. It's supporting our customers going forward as well, all of the customers that we have around the world. And then if you think about on a longer term trajectory, what does this really mean for Honeywell Aerospace? By separating out Honeywell, now we become very, very strategically focused on the aerospace business itself. And it provides a lot of flexibility in terms of capital allocation. How we deploy capital for organic investments, how do we want to deploy capital for inorganic investments, capital deployment within the factories and our facilities to drive growth and enable growth and investments that we need to make. That flexibility that's afforded to us on a longer term horizon provides a foundation to be able to support our customers better and to be able to supply the needs of the industry and the demand needs that are out there in the industry in a much more efficient and productive manner.
I'll get to capital deployment in just a second and also talk to you about possible M&A, but let's talk about demand. And the Honeywell forecast has a very strong demand outlook, not just for the year ahead, but over the next decade. And India, of course, continues to be one of the hotspots as far as demand for commercial aviation is concerned. Give me more color on what you're seeing as far as the demand situation is concerned, and back that up with what we're seeing on the supply side challenges and whether those have started to ease at all.
It is starting to ease some. What I would say on the demand side, I mean, Honeywell is in a very fortuitous position in the fact that we have a breadth of technology that we provide to the aerospace industry, nose to tail on the aircraft. Anything you can think of in terms of integrated avionics, flight management systems, weather radar systems, jet engines, APUs. It's a broad breadth of technology and innovation that we're creating. You combine that with the fact that we support multiple end market segments. So we're not just a commercial business, but we're also a defense business.
Right.
So our portfolio is about 60% commercial, about 40% defense. And of that defense business, about a quarter of it is in the international defense market. And in terms of demand, in my 20 plus years in this industry, I have never seen an opportunity whereby all end markets simultaneously are growing at the levels that they're growing. So it does create a very bright future for the aerospace industry overall. And when you look at backlogs for the major OEMs, multiple years of backlog in
Running
terms
into
of
thousands.
It's unbelievable,
Yeah.
right, what is occurring. And so now you pivot that to the supply side of the equation. With all of the aerospace industry growing in the manner that it's growing, it does create strain within the supply base. So you have to look for alternatives, like how do you support this industry on a go-forward basis to support the demand that is out there commercially and defense as well. And you start looking at where do those opportunities represent. Here in India is a great example. It's an industry in the aerospace industry that is growing substantially. I mean, unprecedented amount of orders from the major airline carriers here in India as a result of that. That creates opportunity for localization. There's tremendous talent here, technologically speaking, tremendous talent from an innovation perspective, tremendous talent from a manufacturing capability as well. So we in Honeywell Aerospace are looking at that very earnestly and looking at opportunities to build out that industrial supply base here in India to support the demand that's required for the Indian aerospace market.
So let's build on that. You know, when we talk about using India as a supply base at this point in time, the exposure that Honeywell currently has is relatively small in comparison to some of the other players. What's the aspiration and where do you believe you could be over the next few years in India?
Yeah, so I think I look at our footprint in India from two perspectives. One of them is the technology and engineering presence that we have in India.
Where you have 3 centers of excellence.
Correct. Right, and we have over 3,000 engineers that only support the aerospace business. And this is something that happened overnight. This is something that we started over 20 years ago and invested hundreds of millions of dollars into the laboratories, the R&D centers to really build out that capability. And that innovation that comes out of India is absolutely amazing for our products. It's a cornerstone of the successes that we have had thus far, and it will still remain to be a cornerstone of our successes going forward. And they're developing some of the most innovative technologies for our industry. Now, the second element of that is the supply side. Right? And so, yes, we have been sourcing material and sourcing supply here out of India. But
could you give me a number for that?
It's not an exact number. I mean, it's relatively small in the grand scheme, but we're looking at quadrupling that within the next few years.
Okay.
And that will drive a lot of growth opportunity here as well in terms of that industrial supply base. But it's also not just about the material and the engineering technology. As the Indian market is growing in the way that it is going to grow in the future, there's going to have to be an ability to maintain, repair, and overhaul those aircraft. And so we're also looking at investing in factories to be able to develop an indigenous capability here in India that is allow us to build on the maintenance, repair, and overhaul that's necessary to support the aircraft here.
And I think this has been a long-standing demand from industry, and many changes have been brought about at the policy level to incentivize setting up MROs in India.
Correct.
Has the regulatory environment become much more facilitative for that to happen?
There's a lot of early conversations around that, and I would say yes, but I think there's a longer journey that still needs to happen to be able to open that up in the speed at which it needs to open up to be able to support the industry here.
So what could it mean then in terms of your own plans as far as MROs are concerned?
Well, if you think about the number of aircraft that are going to be entering into the Indian aerospace industry here, we're talking over 1,000 aircraft from the major OEMs, for which we have substantial content on those aircraft. Some of it is standard equipment, some of it is selectables equipment. So whether we're talking APUs, environmental control systems, avionics, weather radar, radio communications, all of that equipment on those aircraft will be coming into this industry over the years during that growth. There has to be an ability to maintain, repair, and overhaul that going forward. And so looking at regulatory aspects, looking at opportunities to build that infrastructure here is what's of primary importance for us and something that we're committed to do.
And do you expect a decision, what, in the next year, next 2 years, 3 years? What's the broad timeline that we're looking at?
Oh, I think we're within a year of making the decision. I mean, we're already making the decision to actually source more material here to support the industry, but in terms of establishing partnerships and relationships to put an actual footprint for maintenance, repair, and overhaul, we're within a year of making those decisions.
Within a year of making that decision. That's as far as the commercial side is concerned, but you also talked about the defense opportunity. And again, this is an area where the government has decided to prioritize localization. In fact, there's been 3 or 4 lists of indigenized products that the government has put out. How do you see Honeywell playing a role in the indigenization process?
I think it creates a tremendous opportunity. So I think we build upon that from 2 fronts. I mentioned earlier about our engineering footprint that we have here and the innovation and the technology that's being generated out of that. Most of our products that we develop can be applied to either commercial aircraft and or military aircraft and to support the defense industry. So a lot of what we're doing here indigenously in terms of the technology and the innovation that we are creating, we can apply that into the defense market as well. Now, India, historically speaking, has been more of a net importer
yes.
of defense, right? Yes. So as that indigenous capability builds, as the needs of the Indian government and defense needs are fulfilled, I anticipate a true opportunity to become a net exporter of some of this defense equipment.
That is the aspiration.
I believe, and I think it's actually achievable ultimately. I mean, there's a lot of technology and innovation happening here within India that I think becomes then an element where in the future you can be a net exporter of some of this defense technology.
You know, when we talk about defense and what we're seeing happen on account of the decisions that the Trump administration has decided to take is weaponization and defense budgets in Europe now being revived, or at least on the cusp of seeing some revival. What do you make of what is going on with the decisions coming in from the US and the likely impact of that across the world?
Well, the geopolitical landscape is changing, right? It's a very, very stressed environment today. There's conflict occurring around the world. And I think a lot of countries are recognizing a need to have self-sufficiency in terms of their own defense capabilities. And the reliance on other countries for their defense needs, they want to maintain some of that internally themselves. So that creates indigenous opportunities to create new platforms for defense, localization of developing technology and innovation as well. And I think the recognition of the geopolitical landscape changing in the manner that it has caused countries to realize they have underinvested in their own indigenous defense capabilities, and hence why you're seeing a lot of rhetoric coming out of the EU in particular about increasing defense spending, becoming more self-reliant on their defense needs on a go-forward basis. That will create a lot of opportunity ultimately. And for us, we think about our international defense footprint and what we're trying to grow in that regard. We made an acquisition last year of an Italian company called Civitanavi.
Yes.
Purposeful in the EU, it's an Italian company, and purposeful to be able to develop non-ITAR controlled technology in region, in the EU, with a manufacturing footprint in Italy as well to be able to support that growth that is happening. That becomes another anchor for us to be able to build upon supporting the EU and some of the defense needs there. Similarly, we're thinking about doing the same thing here in the Indian defense market as well, and being able to apply that. So there's a clear recognition that a substantial amount of growth is occurring in the international defense markets, and we're going to position ourselves to be able to capitalize on that growth with our products and our technology and our innovation.
You know, you talked about how you're coping with the changing geopolitical landscape, but let's also talk about the changing geoeconomic landscape and the threat of tariffs at this point in time. We're counting down to the 2nd of April when we will see the Trump administration finally take forward what it intends to do as far as tariffs are concerned. How does that impact your plans? How does it impact the supply chain generally for the industry, which has already been fairly stressed and fragile?
Yes, it does create a little bit of anxiety within the supply base, without a doubt. I think the lack of clarity in some regards in terms of how tariffs will apply and when and how much will create a little bit of anxiety. Anxiety creates uncertainty, and uncertainty creates a little bit of trepidation in terms of how do you manage your supply base. What I will tell you is that we're a global company. And as a global aerospace company, I have manufacturing facilities all over the world that are supporting the industry at large around the world, whether it's civilian or whether it's defense related. And so we closely monitor what is occurring. I look at the current tariff situation, and albeit it's very dynamic,
yes.
It can change, from one day to the next.
Or one tweet to the next.
Or one tweet to the next. But under the current set of circumstances that are in play for us in Honeywell Aerospace, it's a negligible amount of impact that we would see in our business, and it wouldn't change our desire and our continued efforts to focus on investments back into the supply base and continuing to grow.
So how do you then look at building out the supply chain resilience? Because we saw this happen post the pandemic, where most people were talking about diversifying risks, diversifying supply chains.
Correct.
In this current context where there seems to be an effort to move manufacturing back to the US, what does it really do to supply chain expansion and diversification plans for a company like yours?
Well, first and foremost, thinking about the demand that is out there requires a completely different set of circumstances and decision making to be able to supply to that demand. The geopolitical landscape is a player in that. So we looked at our supply base from start to finish, and we started evaluating where we were single sourced, where we weren't dual sourced, multi-sourced, where do we have some specialized capability internally as well to be able to move some products back inside. So we are revamping our internal supply base within Honeywell Aerospace to look at dual sourcing, multi-sourcing, moving around supply base for geopolitical concerns may exist. Where is the demand, i.e. what we talked about earlier, here in India, establishing an ecosystem of a supply base here to support our products here in India as well. So you kind of have to see where the demand is moving and where it's occurring, and then just position yourselves accordingly for that.
We are going to head into a break and continue our conversation on Honeywell's plans for India and the aerospace business. That and more when we return on the Global Dialogue.